Drowning in pain, he became her strength. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the city streets into rivers of sorrow that seemed to mirror the endless tears streaming down Sarah's face. She sat in the driver's seat of her broken-down Honda, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel, watching the water rise around her car like the overwhelming grief that threatened to consume her entirely. Just 6 months ago, her world had been perfect. She had been planning her wedding to Michael, dreaming of their future together, decorating their first apartment with care and love. They had talked about children, about growing old together, about all the beautiful possibilities that life could offer. But fate, cruel and merciless, had other plans. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in March. Michael had been driving to work, singing along to their favorite song on the radio, when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into his car at 60 miles per hour. The impact was so severe that the paramedics later told her he wouldn't have felt any pain. But Sarah felt enough pain for both of them, a crushing, suffocating agony that made it impossible to breathe, to eat, to sleep, to exist. In the months that followed, Sarah had tried everything to escape the darkness. She threw herself into work, staying at the office until midnight, hoping exhaustion would quiet the voices in her head. She tried therapy, meditation, support groups, antidepressants, anything that might help her find a way back to the person she used to be. But nothing worked. The pain only grew deeper, more persistent, like a cancer eating away at her soul. Her friends and family had been patient at first, bringing casseroles and offering shoulders to cry on. But as the weeks turned into months, their visits became less frequent, their calls shorter. They wanted her to move on, to find closure, to start living again. They didn't understand that she wasn't living at all anymore. She was simply surviving, one breath at a time, in a world that felt empty and meaningless without Michael. Tonight had been the final straw. Her sister had called, frustrated and exhausted, telling Sarah that she needed to get help, or stop dragging everyone down with her. The words had hit like physical blows, and Sarah had hung up the phone and walked out into the storm without a coat, without a plan, without hope. Now, as the water continued to rise around her car, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. The rain was so heavy she could barely see through the windshield, and the engine had died 20 minutes ago when the water reached the exhaust pipe. She was stranded in what appeared to be an underpass, with flood water rising steadily toward the windows. In the backseat, she could see the faces of her children, not real children, but the imaginary ones she and Michael had dreamed about. A little girl with his dark hair and her green eyes. A boy with Michael's gentle smile and her stubborn chin. They would never exist now, would never call her mommy, would never fill the house with laughter and chaos and unconditional love. Sarah closed her eyes and let the tears fall freely, mixing with the rain that had somehow found its way through the old car's weather stripping. She thought about Michael, about how he would feel if he could see her now. He had always been her strength, the one who encouraged her to chase her dreams, who believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. What would he say about this moment, about her giving up? The sound of someone tapping on her window made her jump. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see a man's silhouette. He was soaked to the bone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, but his eyes were kind and concerned. He was gesturing for her to roll down the window, shouting something she couldn't hear over the storm. Sarah hesitated. Part of her wanted to ignore him, to let the water rise until it covered the car completely. But something about his persistence, his refusal to walk away, made her crack the window just enough to hear his voice. "Ma'am, are you okay?" He called out, his voice strong despite the chaos around them. "The water's rising fast. We need to get you out of there." "I'm fine," Sarah lied, her voice barely a whisper. "Just go. Leave me alone." But the man didn't leave. Instead, he waded deeper into the flood water, which was now reaching his knees. "Listen to me," he said, his voice urgent but gentle. "I don't know what you're going through, but I know that look in your eyes. I've been where you are." Sarah looked at him more closely. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with kind eyes and a face that spoke of someone who had experienced his own share of pain. There was something about his presence that felt safe, trustworthy. "My name is David," he continued, rain streaming down his face. 3 years ago, I lost my wife and daughter in a car accident. I was driving. I survived, and for the longest time, I wished I hadn't." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She could hear the genuine pain in his voice, could see the shadows of grief that still lingered in his eyes. But there was something else there too, a strength, a light that hadn't been completely extinguished. I spent 2 years drowning in guilt and sorrow, David said, his hand pressed against her window. I pushed everyone away, lost my job, my home, my sense of purpose. I ended up living on the streets, convinced that I deserved nothing better. But someone helped me realize that surviving didn't make me guilty, it made me responsible for living a life that would honor their memory. The water was now reaching the bottom of Sarah's door. She could feel the car shifting slightly with the current, and fear began to penetrate through her numbness. But David remained steady, his presence an anchor in the storm. I can see you're in pain, he said softly. The kind of pain that makes you feel like you're drowning even when you're on dry land. But this isn't the answer. There are people who need you, who would be devastated to lose you. And there are ways to carry your grief that don't require you to surrender your life. Sarah found herself really looking at him for the first time. Despite the rain and the dangerous situation, there was something peaceful about him, something that suggested he had found a way to coexist with his pain rather than be consumed by it. How? She whispered, her voice breaking. How do you go on when everything inside you is dead? David's expression softened with understanding. One day at a time. One breath at a time. You don't get over it, you learn to carry it differently. You find ways to honor what you've lost while still allowing yourself to live. The water was now lapping at the bottom of Sarah's window, and David moved closer to the car. But right now, we need to focus on getting you safe. Will you let me help you? For the first time in months, Sarah felt a spark of something other than despair. It wasn't hope exactly, but it wasn't complete darkness either. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the recognition of a kindred spirit who had somehow found a way through the maze of grief. She nodded slowly and unlocked the car door. David immediately moved to help her out of the vehicle, his strong arms steadying her as she stepped into the rushing water. The current was stronger than she had expected, and without his support, she would have been swept away immediately. There's higher ground about 50 yards that way. He shouted over the storm, pointing toward what looked like a small hill. Can you make it? Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure. The water was cold and the current was fierce, but David's hand in hers felt like a lifeline. Step by step, they made their way through the flood, with David constantly checking to make sure she was okay, adjusting his pace to match hers, never letting go. When they finally reached safety, both of them collapsed on the wet grass, breathing heavily. Sarah looked back at her car, now almost completely submerged, and felt a strange mix of loss and relief. The car had been one of the last connections she had to her old life with Michael. They had bought it together, had taken road trips in it, had made love in the backseat during their college years. Thank you, she said finally, turning to look at David. I don't know why you stopped to help me. David smiled, and for the first time, Sarah noticed that it was a genuine smile, not forced or artificial. Because someone stopped to help me once. A homeless veteran who had every reason to ignore a suicidal drunk, but chose to sit with me on a bridge until the sun came up. He didn't try to fix me or give me easy answers. He just reminded me that pain shared as pain lessened. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the storm rage around them. Sarah found herself thinking about Michael, but for the first time in months, the thoughts weren't purely agonizing. She remembered how he used to love storms, how he would stand on their apartment balcony and watch the lightning dance across the sky. What was her name? Sarah asked suddenly. Your wife. Emma, David replied, his voice soft with memory. And our daughter was Lucy. She would have been 6 years old last month. Sarah could hear the love in his voice, mixed with the grief, but somehow the love seemed stronger. Michael, she said in response. We were supposed to get married in June. They talked through the night as the storm gradually subsided. David told her about his journey through grief, about the dark days and the gradual emergence of light. He spoke about the guilt that had nearly destroyed him, the way he had blamed himself for surviving when his family hadn't. He talked about the therapy that had eventually helped, the support group where he had met other people learning to rebuild their lives after devastating loss. Sarah found herself opening up in a way she hadn't been able to with anyone else. Maybe it was because David truly understood, or maybe it was because she had nothing left to lose. She told him about the dreams that haunted her sleep, about the way she sometimes forgot for a moment that Michael was gone and would reach for the phone to call him. She talked about the anger she felt toward God, toward the drunk driver, toward a universe that seemed fundamentally unfair. As the dawnlight began to filter through the clouds, David shared something that would stay with Sarah forever. "The goal isn't to get back to who you were before," he said. "That person is gone, and trying to resurrect her will only lead to more pain. The goal is to discover who you are now, carrying this love and this loss, and to build a life that acknowledges both." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, not healing exactly, but maybe the beginning of a willingness to heal. For months, she had been fighting against her grief, trying to push it away or sink beneath it entirely. But David was suggesting a third option, learning to dance with it, to let it be part of her without letting it define her completely. Over the following weeks, David became Sarah's guide through the labyrinth of grief recovery. He introduced her to his support group, a circle of people who had all lost someone significant and were learning to reconstruct their lives around the absence. There was Maria, whose teenage son had died of leukemia; James, whose parents had been killed in a home invasion; Ruth, whose husband of 40 years had died of Alzheimer's. At first, Sarah felt like an outsider, convinced that her pain was somehow different, more intense than what others were experiencing. But gradually, she began to recognize the common threads: the guilt, the anger, the desperate bargaining with a universe that didn't seem to be listening. More importantly, she began to see that it was possible to carry profound loss without being destroyed by it. David taught her practical strategies for managing the worst days. He showed her how to create rituals that honored Michael's memory without keeping her trapped in the past. Together, they visited Michael's grave for the first time since the funeral, and Sarah was surprised to find that talking to him there brought comfort rather than fresh agony. "Grief isn't something you solve," David explained one afternoon as they walked through the park where he scattered his family's ashes. "It's something you integrate. It becomes part of your story, but not the whole story." Sarah began to understand what he meant. Her love for Michael didn't have to die with him, it could transform into something that propelled her forward rather than holding her back. She started volunteering at a local hospital, spending time with patients who were facing their own battles with mortality. She found that being present for others in their pain somehow helped her process her own. Months passed, and Sarah began to notice small changes. She could sleep through the night occasionally. She could laugh at something funny without immediately feeling guilty. She could make plans for the future, even if they were small ones. The weight of grief was still there, but it no longer felt like it was crushing her. David had become more than just a guide, he had become a friend, and eventually, something deeper. Sarah felt guilty about the growing feelings between them, as if caring for someone new was a betrayal of Michael's memory. But David helped her understand that love isn't a finite resource, that opening her heart again didn't diminish what she had shared with Michael. "Michael loved you," David said one evening as they sat watching the sunset. "Don't you think he would want you to be loved again?" Sarah knew he was right. Michael had been generous and kind, never possessive or jealous. He would have wanted her to find happiness, even if it had to be with someone else. The relationship with David developed slowly, built on a foundation of mutual understanding and shared experience with loss. They both knew that they were changed people, that their capacity for love had been deepened by their encounters with grief. They didn't try to recreate what they had lost, but instead worked to build something new and beautiful from the pieces of their broken hearts. 2 years after that stormy night when David pulled her from the flood, Sarah stood in a small church, wearing a simple white dress, preparing to marry the man who had become her strength when she thought she had none left. Michael's parents were there, smiling through their tears, having grown to love David as the man who had saved their daughter-in-law's life in more ways than one. Before the ceremony, Sarah visited Michael's grave, bringing him the bouquet she would carry down the aisle. "I will always love you," she whispered to the headstone. "And I know you would want me to be happy. David makes me happy, but he also honors what we had. He never asks me to forget you or pretend you didn't exist." As she walked down the aisle toward David, Sarah felt Michael's presence not as a haunting spirit, but as a blessing. She carried him with her into this new chapter of her life, not as baggage, but as a part of her story that had taught her how precious and fragile love could be. In his vows, David promised not to try to replace what Sarah had lost, but to help her carry it with grace. He promised to honor Michael's memory by loving Sarah with the same intensity and devotion that Michael had shown her. In her vows, Sarah promised to live fully, to embrace joy when it came, to build a life that would make Michael proud. She promised to let David love her completely, without holding back parts of her heart in tribute to the past. Their wedding was small but profound, a celebration not just of their love for each other, but of their victory over despair. Every person in attendance understood that they were witnessing something miraculous, the resurrection of two people who had been buried alive by grief and had somehow found their way back to the surface. Years later, when Sarah held their first child, a daughter with David's kind eyes and Sarah's stubborn chin, she felt Michael's presence in the room, not as a ghost, but as a guardian angel watching over the family she had built from the ashes of her first love. She named the baby Emma Grace, Emma for David's lost daughter, Grace for the unmerited gift of second chances. As she looked down at the sleeping infant, Sarah understood that pain and joy could coexist, that loss and love were not opposites but partners in the complex dance of human existence. David had saved her that night in the flood, but more importantly, he had taught her how to save herself. He had shown her that drowning in pain was a choice, that there were other ways to honor the dead than to join them. He had become her strength not by taking away her grief, but by helping her transform it into something that could fuel her life rather than end it. In the end, Sarah learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting her, moving on. It means learning to carry love and loss together, to let both shape you into someone who can hold space for the full spectrum of human experience. It means understanding that our deepest wounds can become our greatest sources of strength, and that sometimes the person who saves us is someone who has been saved themselves. The floodwaters had receded long ago, but the lessons they carried remained. Sarah had drowned in pain, but David had taught her how to swim. Together, they had built a life that honored both their losses and their love, proving that even in the depths of despair, hope can find a way to take root and grow.